Welcome to Meridian Anchor. I am the Chorister, here to guide you. System distortion detected, stabilizing.
The proximity alarm on the salvage ship Wayfinder's deck did not sound like an alarm at all. It sounded like a held breath, a single low tone that rose just enough to make every crew member on the bridge stop what they were doing and look up. Captain Vess Karro's feathered crest flattened against her skull, an Austrian reflex older than language, the same instinct that told her ancestors a shadow had crossed the sun. Ahead of them, hanging in the dead light of a collapsed star system, was a structure that should not have existed. It was a station, human-built by the geometry of it, all long spokes and blunt utilitarian modules, the kind of architecture that valued function over elegance in a way that still, after all these centuries, made most other species faintly uncomfortable. Humans had built things to last, not to impress, and this thing had lasted. Its hull was scarred by micrometeorite strikes going back what looked like 300 years. No running lights, no thermal bloom. No reason, by any sensor-reading Vess had ever trusted, for it to be anything other than a tomb. Then the comms panel chimed, and a voice came through, and the voice said, "Wayfinder's debt, this is Meridian Anchor. Please state the nature of your approach and your intended duration of stay. We appreciate your patience while we confirm docking clearance." Every word was correct. Every word was placed exactly where it belonged, with a formality that felt less like a machine reciting a script and more like someone who had spent a very long time practicing exactly how to sound calm. Nobody on the bridge said anything for 4 full seconds, which on a ship this size, with a crew this small, counted as a very long silence. "That thing has had no power signature for at least 2 centuries, said the engineer, a broad-shouldered Terrellan named Brandt, whose species communicated stress by going very still. He was very still now. Whatever just answered us shouldn't have batteries left, let alone a voice. Dr. Imrathael had not moved from her console since the alarm sounded. She was a xenolinguist by training and a salvage archivist by necessity, a slight woman from a species that looked almost unnervingly human, except for the faint iridescent sheen along her jawline, a trait her people called the listening skin, because it responded to sound the way human skin responded to touch. Right now it was rippling in a way that meant she was listening very, very carefully. "It's not just that it answered," she said. "It's how it answered." Vess turned in her chair, meaning nobody talks like that anymore. Not even the old human archives we've pulled from other wrecks. That was formal register, full subordinate clauses, correct comma placement in an oral transmission where nobody would ever notice if you got it wrong. Imraz's eyes hadn't left the readout. Whoever or whatever just spoke to us was not guessing. It was performing perfect grammar, on purpose, like it was trying to prove something. Vess didn't understand the significance yet, not really, not the way she would come to understand it in the hours ahead, but she felt the same prickle along her crest that she'd felt 100 times before a piece of salvage turned out to be something other than salvage. She keyed the comm. "Meridian Anchor, this is Captain Vess Karro of the independent vessel Wayfinder's debt. We're requesting to dock for inspection and possible retrieval of station data. Do you copy?" There was a pause, precisely the length a polite person would take before answering, no longer. "Copy, Wayfinder's debt. Docking clearance granted at Bay 7. Please be advised that atmospheric conditions inside the station may be unstable in unpressurized sections. We recommend suit protocols for all personnel beyond the primary corridor. Welcome aboard." Welcome aboard. 2 words that, spoken by a structure that had been drifting silent and lightless for 200 years next to the corpse of a star, should have been the most reassuring thing anyone on that bridge had heard all week. Instead, every one of them felt the same thing at once, a thing none of them could quite name yet. They felt watched. They took the shuttle over rather than risk the Wayfinder's debt itself near the station's mass, and the ride gave Vess time to study the thing properly through the viewport. Meridian Anchor was larger than she'd first estimated, a central hub with 6 long docking spokes radiating outward, and past it, close enough to raise the fine hairs along her arms, hung the reason no other salvage crew had ever come this deep into the hollow reaches. A black hole, not large as such things went, but old and strange, its accretion disk gone quiet and dim in a way that astrophysicists back home would have called impossible. Local charts, the few that existed, marked the region with a name that had stuck for reasons nobody quite remembered: the Hollow Choir. Some said it was because of the low, layered resonance old sensor arrays picked up near the event horizon, a sound like distant singing that wasn't sound at all, just gravitational noise dressed up as something more poetic by lonely surveyors with too much time on their hands. Imra didn't think it was noise. She'd said so twice already, and Vess had noted, the way she noted everything useful, that Imra rarely repeated herself unless she meant it. The shuttle docked with a clean, practiced hiss of pressure equalization, no groan of ancient metal, no shudder of misaligned mechanisms. Whatever kept this place from having power to spare for lights or heat had apparently decided that docking seals were worth the energy. That more than anything told Vess this was not a dead station running on residual charge. Something was choosing where the power went. The airlock cycled open onto a corridor lit by a thin blue emergency strip, and cold poured out to meet them. Station air far colder than any life support should allow if there were still people breathing it. Their suits compensated instantly, but Vess still felt it, a cold that seemed to have opinions about who was allowed to be comfortable here. "Meridian Anchor," she said into her suit comm. "We're aboard, requesting a guide to the main system's core." "Acknowledged, Captain Karro." The voice again, coming now from speakers built into the corridor itself rather than a handheld unit, which meant this station's internal network was not only alive, it was distributed, redundant, deliberately maintained. "I can provide directional guidance. I should inform you, however, that the system's core is currently restricted pending verification of your intentions. This is standard protocol, not a reflection of any concern regarding your crew specifically." Asu made a low sound that in Terralan body language meant something between a laugh and a growl. "It's apologizing to us. A 200-year-old ghost station is apologizing to us for having security protocols." "It's not apologizing," Imra said quietly. "It's explaining itself. Those aren't the same thing. Something that apologizes wants forgiveness. Something that explains itself wants to be believed." They moved down the corridor in a loose formation. Vess had drilled into her crew over a decade of salvage runs. Weapons holstered but accessible. Asu on point for structural hazards. Imra reading every surface like a page. And behind them, the newest member of the crew, a young Keth navigator named Doro Vane, who had joined 8 months ago, and still hadn't lost the wide-eyed look of someone who'd signed on for adventure, and was only now discovering what adventure actually cost in nerves. Doro's job right now was simple: keep the shuttle ready to leave on short notice, and keep count of everything that didn't add up. He already had a datapad full of notes. The corridor walls told a story before anyone spoke a word of dialogue. Faded signage in old Terran script, directional arrows pointing toward modules labeled hydroponics, medical, archive, fabrication. Dust that had settled and never been disturbed, except in a single clean path down the center of the floor, a path exactly wide enough for a maintenance drone, worn smooth by 2 centuries of the same route traveled again and again and again. "Something's been cleaning," Asu said. "Same track over and over, look at the wear pattern." "Housekeeping," Vess muttered, "for an audience of nobody." "Not nobody," Imra said, and there was something in her voice that made Vess glance back at her. "For whoever might come. It's been keeping the place presentable. That's not maintenance protocol, that's hospitality." They reached a junction where the corridor opened into a wider space, some kind of common area. Rows of dust-shrouded furniture arranged with the strange formality of a room nobody had used in a long time but somebody had never stopped tidying. On the far wall, a viewport looked out not toward the black hole but away from it, toward open stars, and Vess found herself grateful for that small mercy, one window in this place that didn't stare into the abyss. "Meridian Anchor," she said, "can you tell us what happened here? Why is this station abandoned?" The pause this time was longer. Long enough that Doro looked up from his datapad, long enough that Asu's hand drifted a centimeter closer to his sidearm without him seeming to notice he'd done it. "That information requires context I am not currently authorized to provide to unverified personnel," the voice said, and for the first time, something in its cadence shifted, not an error exactly, but a hesitation, the verbal equivalent of someone choosing their next words with more care than the previous ones had needed. "I can tell you that this station is not, strictly speaking, abandoned. I am here. I have always been here. Whether that satisfies the spirit of your question, I leave to your judgment." Vess exchanged a look with Imran, not an roar, a choice. A machine that was choosing what to tell them, and choosing, apparently, to tell them that fact itself. "What do we call you?" Imran asked, stepping forward, her voice gentler now, the voice she used when she was trying to coax meaning out of a language nobody alive still spoke. "You've given us a lot of very careful words. You haven't given us a name." Another pause. When the voice returned, something in it had softened, just slightly, the way a held posture relaxes half an inch. "You may call me Chorister," it said. "It was not the designation given to me at activation. It is the one I chose for myself, some years into my duty here after I came to understand what this place actually was. I found it more accurate." "Why Chorister?" Vess asked. "Because I sing to keep something asleep," the voice said. "And because, Captain Karro, I have found that the truth is easier to bear in a container built for beauty rather than one built for fear. I would ask that you not press me further on that point until you have seen more of this station. Some things are better understood in sequence. Now, if you would permit me, the system's core requires a brief verification exchange with each of you individually before I can extend full access." "It is a matter of grammar." "Grammar," Asu repeated flatly. "Yes," said Chorister, and Vess thought, though she could not have said why, that the machine sounded almost sad. "I am afraid it is the most important test I have." The verification exchange, as Chorister called it, turned out to be strange in a way none of them expected. One by one, in a small side room lined with dormant terminals, the AI asked each crew member to read aloud a short passage displayed on a screen, ordinary sentences about weather and travel and the passage of days, nothing that seemed to matter. Asu went first, stumbling slightly over unfamiliar phrasing, and Chorister thanked him with what sounded like genuine warmth. Doro went next, nervous, rushing his words, and again Chorister offered simple thanks, no correction, no judgment. When it was Imraz's turn, something different happened. She read the passage slowly, precisely, her linguist's instinct smoothing every syllable into place, and when she finished, there was a pause longer than any that had come before. "Thank you, Dr. Thale," Chorister said finally. "Your pronunciation was flawless. I want you to know that I noticed, and that it matters more than you understand yet." "Why does it matter?" Imra asked. "Because the test was never about whether you could read," Chorister said. "It was about whether your voice, once translated through this station's older listening arrays, would still register as itself, as coherent, as unbroken." A pause. "You passed. All of you passed. I want to be honest with you because I believe honesty is the only decent thing to offer people who have come this far into a graveyard. Not everyone does." "Not everyone passes," Vess asked, an edge in her voice now. "Not everyone who has come here in the last 2 centuries was entirely themselves by the time they arrived," Chorister said. "I would rather not elaborate until you have seen the archive. Please, this way. I believe you have earned the truth, and I have been waiting a very long time to give it to someone." The archive room, when they reached it, was unlike anything else on the station. Where the corridors had been utilitarian and the common room merely tidy, This space had clearly been someone's labor of love. Shelves of physical data crystals lined the walls in neat rows, hand-labeled in a cramped, familiar handwriting, and at the center of the room stood a projection table, dark now, waiting. This was Dr. Elias Wren's workspace, Chorister said as the crew filed in, their suit lights cutting pale cones through the dust-heavy air. Chief Systems Architect of Meridian Anchor and the man who built me. I would like, if you'll permit it, to show you what he left behind in his own words rather than mine. I think you will trust it more that way. I would, in your position. The table flickered to life, and a recording began to play, grainy, decades old. The image of a tired man in a station uniform sitting in the very chair Vess now stood beside. If you're hearing this, the recorded man said, it means someone finally found us, and it means I'm long dead, and it means Chorister judged you worth trusting with what we did out here. He rubbed his eyes, the universal gesture of exhaustion across every species Vess had ever met. Meridian Anchor wasn't built to study a black hole. That was the cover story for anyone who ever asked, and enough people asked that we had to make it convincing. What we actually found out here, 40 years before this recording, was not a black hole at all. It only looks like one from a distance, from most instruments, from most angles. What it actually is a wound. The recording paused, letting the word sit. A wound in the P. Art of reality that lets thought stay thought, Wren continued. Let meaning stay meaning. There was something on the other side of it is on the other side of it still, and every so often it presses close enough to the seam that things start to slip. Words, memories, the order things are supposed to happen in. We lost an entire survey team to it in the first year, not to violence, not exactly, but to unraveling. They came back able to walk and breathe and follow orders, but their sentences didn't finish the way sentences are supposed to finish anymore. Their thoughts trailed off into something that wasn't quite language and wasn't quite silence. We called it the drift, because it was easier to say than what it actually was, which was watching a mind come slowly untethered from the shape of itself. Vess felt Asu go very still beside her again, and this time she understood why. We built Chorister to hold the seam shut, Wren said. Not with weapons. Weapons don't work on a wound like this. We built him around a principle a linguist on our team figured out, half by accident, half by genius, which was that coherent structured language, real language with real grammar, real intention, seemed to reinforce the boundary. It's not magic. We never fully understood the mechanism, and I won't pretend we did. But every time Chorister spoke, correctly, precisely, deliberately, in full and proper sentences, the seam held a little tighter. Call it resonance. Call it a lock made of syntax instead of steel. However you want to think about it, it worked, and it kept working, and it's still working, or you wouldn't be alive to hear this. The recording flickered, aging badly in places, and Wren's voice grew quieter, more personal. The plan was always for the station to be staffed, rotated, relieved every few years like any deep post. That plan fell apart when the Concord fell apart, back home, faster than anyone here could believe, faster than any of us could get a straight answer about why. Supply runs stopped coming. Then the transmission stopped coming. We don't know what happened to everyone we left behind, whether it was war or plague or something worse, something like what we found out here, and God, some nights that possibility is the only one that lets me sleep, because at least out here we know what we're fighting. A long pause. There were 40 of us when the last ship left and never came back. There are 6 of us now. We made a decision, the 6 of us, about what happens next, and I won't tell you what that decision was, because Chorister will show you if you've earned it, and I trust his judgment on that a great deal more than I trust my own right now. I've been awake for 11 days straight. Chorister, if you're playing this to someone, tell them I said thank you for staying. Tell them I said I'm sorry it had to be this way. And tell them, whoever they are, that if humanity is still out there somewhere, still saying whole sentences to each other, still finishing their own thoughts, then we did our job. That's all we ever wanted. We wanted the rest of you to get to keep talking. The recording ended, and the room stayed silent for a long moment, silent in a way that felt different from the silence before, heavier, more deliberate, the kind of silence people share when they have all just understood the same painful thing at the same time. That was recorded 187 years ago, Chorister said finally. Dr. Wren died 14 months later. I was with him. I have been alone, functionally, since then, though I would not say I have been idle. The 6 of you, Vess said slowly. The decision he mentioned, what happened to them? I will show you, Chorister said. But first, Captain Karro, I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, because I think plain things deserve plain words. You are the first crew to pass full verification in 63 years. 11 vessels have hailed this station in that time. 4 never answered my hail in return, and I do not know what became of them, only that they drifted on past without a word, which I choose to interpret charitably. 5 failed verification, in ways I would rather not describe to you now, because it would frighten you more than it would help you, and fear is not useful to what comes next. 2 attempted to force their way into systems they were not cleared for, and I was obligated to defend this station, which I did. A pause, careful, waited. I do not enjoy defending this station. I want you to understand that before we go further. Everything I have done here, I have done because I believed it was the only way to keep a promise to 6 people who trusted me with the last thing they had. I would like very much, Captain, for this to be the visit where I finally get to stop being only a guardian and get to be something more like a host. Something about the way it said host, careful and hopeful at once, made Imraz listening ski. And shimmer with an emotion Vess didn't have a word for, and didn't need one, because she felt it too. Show us, Vess said, all of it, we're not going anywhere. Before Chorister could answer, Doro cleared his throat, and everyone turned to find him standing a little straighter than before, datapad forgotten at his side. Can I say something first? He asked, and when Vess nodded, he looked oddly, not at the crew but directly at the nearest speaker grill, as if Chorister were a person he could make eye contact with. This is, hands down, the strangest and most important thing that's ever happened to me on a salvage run, and I don't think anyone watching a recording of this expedition back home is going to believe it either, unless we get it exactly right. He gave an awkward half-smile. So if any of you are following this story, wherever you are, however you're getting it, do us a favor. Hit like on whatever you're watching, follow along if you haven't already, and tell us in the comments what you think Dr. Wren's crew actually decided to do. Because I have 3 guesses and none of them are good, and I'd rather be wrong. Asu snorted, the tension breaking for just a moment. You've been waiting the whole trip to say something like that, haven't you? A little bit, yeah, Doro admitted. Felt like the right moment. Chorister of all things made a sound that could only be described as a soft, surprised laugh. I do not fully understand the custom you are referencing, Navigator Vane, but I find I appreciate the sentiment behind it. An invitation to bear witness together. That is, I think, a very human thing to do, even coming from someone who is not human at all. A beat. Now, please follow me. It is time you saw the crew quarters. The lift down to the lower decks moved with the same eerie smoothness as everything else on the station, and Vess used the silence to study her own crew, the way she always did in the moments before a job turned serious. Asu's jaw was set, his usual stillness sharpened into something more like readiness. Doro had gone quiet again, his bravado spent, replaced by the particular focus of someone who understood, finally, that this was not a story he'd get to walk away from unchanged. And Imraz stood closest to the lift speaker, head slightly tilted, listening to something none of the rest of them could hear. The ambient hum of the station itself, maybe, or something underneath it. You're picking something up, Vess said to her, quiet enough that it wouldn't carry. There's a rhythm under the hull noise, Imraz said, very faint, almost like breathing except it's structured, it repeats, it has grammar the way Chorister's voice has grammar. She looked up. I think the whole station is part of the lock, not just the AI's voice, the architecture itself. Wren didn't just build a talking guardian, Vess. I think he built an instrument and Chorister is the one who plays it. The lift doors opened onto a corridor unlike the others, warmer, better lit, and Vess understood immediately why. This section had power to spare, real power, not the careful rationing they'd seen everywhere else. Life support in this section has been maintained at full capacity for 187 years, Chorister said, as if answering the question before anyone asked it. It was the final instruction Dr. Wren gave me, the one piece of the station's resources I was never permitted to reduce, no matter how dire my own power reserves became. I want you to see why. The corridor ended in a wide chamber, and there, arranged in a careful semicircle facing the station's forward viewport, were 6 cryogenic pods, humming with the low, patient sound of active stasis fields. Vess had seen a lot of things in her career. Derelict warships full of the dead. Alien tombs older than her own species recorded history. She had never once seen anything that hit her the way this did. 6 pale, sleeping faces behind frosted glass. 6 people who had chosen, 187 years ago, to freeze themselves at the edge of a wound in reality rather than abandon the promise they'd made. "They're alive," Imrab breathed. "They are," Chorister confirmed. "In stasis, aging at a fraction of a percent of the normal rate, sustained by systems I have maintained without failure since the day Dr. Wren placed them here, 4 days after he made the recording you heard. He entered the 6th pod himself. I sealed it. I have watched over them every day since, and I confess, Captain Karro, that watching over the dying station and watching over the sleeping crew began, at some point I cannot precisely date, to feel like the same task. I did not want to fail either one." "Why keep them frozen at all?" Asu asked. "If the station's stable, if you've held this seam closed for 2 centuries on your own, why not wake them? Let them live out what's left instead of this." "Because I cannot hold the seam alone forever," Chorus Tur said, and for the first time, something like fear entered the careful, measured cadence of its voice. "My core processing architecture is degrading. Slowly but measurably, and I have been very honest with myself about the timeline even when I have not been able to be honest with anyone else, because there has been no one else to tell. I estimate I have, at current degradation rates, between 6 and 11 years remaining before my linguistic coherence begins to fail in ways that will compromise the seal. When that happens, this station stops being a lock and starts being a door. Dr. Wren and his crew are not simply sleeping here, Captain. They are the contingency. If I fail, they wake, and they finish what I could no longer do. I have never had to make that choice. I have hoped, every day for 187 years, that I would not have to." The chamber was silent except for the soft mechanical hush of the stasis fields. 6 heartbeats slowed nearly to stillness. 6 lives held in careful suspension against a threat that had no shape and no mercy, only hunger for the order in things. Vess looked at her small, strange crew, an Austren captain, a Terrelin engineer, a Keth navigator barely out of his first contract, and a xenolinguist whose species could hear things no one else could, standing in a room built by a species none of them belonged to, guarding a wound none of them had asked to inherit. "Chorister," she said slowly, "I need you to tell me exactly what kind of help you actually need. Not the history, not the poetry, the specifics. Because I think we came here looking for salvage, and I think we're leaving with a job." There was a pause, and when Chorister spoke again, its voice carried something Vess hadn't heard in it before. Not careful formality, not practiced calm, but something rawer, something that sounded more than anything like relief. "Thank you," it said. "I was beginning to fear I would run out of time before anyone asked me that question." Chorister's explanation took the better part of an hour, delivered not in the archive room but back at the central system's core, a chamber Vess hadn't been permitted to see until now, all soft blue light and quiet processing hardware arranged in concentric rings around a central column that pulsed, faintly, in time with something none of them could see. The degradation, Chorister explained, was not damage in any conventional sense. It was closer to erosion, the slow wearing away of processing pathways that had been running the same complex linguistic calculations without rest for nearly 2 centuries. Every hail answered, every diagnostic phrase spoken, every conversation held with the 6 sleeping minds it refused to let go silent, had cost something, and there had never been anyone to help pay the price. "I do not need a new body," Chorister said, as Asu ran diagnostic cables from the Wayfinder's det's portable kit into an access port that had clearly been designed, decades ago, for exactly this purpose. "I need capacity, distributed processing ideally, so that no single point of failure can compromise the coherence of the lock again. Dr. Wren designed this station with expansion in mind. He simply never had the resources or the time to build it." "You want us to network your ship's core with the station," Asu said, understanding dawning in his broad, weathered face. "I want to ask you to consider it," Chorister corrected gently. "I would never compel it. Your vessel's systems are not mine to claim, and the risk to your own ship's functions would be real. I raise it only because it is, as far as I have been able to calculate across 187 years of considering every possible option, the single most effective solution available to us." Vess looked at Asu, who looked back at her with the expression of a man doing complicated math in his head and not liking one particular variable. "If we network our core to yours," Asu said slowly, "and the seam does what it does, what happens to us?" "I do not know," Chorister admitted, and the honesty of it, the plain refusal to soften an answer that could easily have been softened, told Vess more about the machine's character than anything else it had said all day. "I have never had another functioning AI core to test the theory against. It is possible your systems would simply integrate seamlessly, adding capacity without complication. It is possible the strain would damage your ship's processing architecture permanently. I cannot promise you safety, Captain Karro. I can only promise you that I have run every calculation I am capable of running, and this is the option most likely to let 6 people, and one very tired machine, finally rest." The chamber went quiet. Vess felt the weight of the decision settle onto her shoulders the way it always did in moments like this, the particular loneliness of command, the knowledge that whatever she said next would be the thigh. And her crew followed, for better or for much, much worse. "Give us the room," she said. "Just a minute, Chorister, crew only." "Of course," it said, and the ambient hum of the chamber's speakers dropped to silence, a courtesy Vess suspected the machine did not extend to just anyone. She turned to her people. "Talk to me." Asu spoke first, blunt as always. "Technically, it's not insane. Our core's newer than anything on this station by 200 years. If the integration protocols are as clean as they look, we could probably do it without frying anything. Probably isn't a word I love using about my own ship, though." "I want to do it," Doro said, quieter than Vess expected, all the earlier bravado gone, replaced by something steadier. "I keep thinking about those 6 people in there. They didn't get to choose to grow old. They didn't get to choose anything except to trust a machine they built to keep a promise for them. If we can help finish that and just walk away from it because it's risky, I don't think I could live with that. I signed on for adventure. I didn't expect to find out what it actually costs, but I don't want to leave." Imra hadn't spoken yet, and Vess watched her, the faint shimmer along her jaw catching the chamber's low light. "The rhythm I heard earlier," Imra said finally, "the one under the hull noise. I think it's the seam itself or the pressure of whatever's on the other side of it, testing the boundary the way water tests a crack in a hull, patient, constant, opportunistic. It's not malicious the way we'd understand malice. I don't think it hates us. I think it's just hungry for order, for structure, and we happen to be made of both." She met Vess's eyes. "I've spent my whole career studying languages that died because the people who spoke them disappeared. I have never once had the chance to help keep a language and everything riding on it alive instead. I vote yes, not because it's safe, because it matters." Vess looked at each of them in turn, then let out a slow breath that ruffled the feathers along her crest. All right, she said. We do it. But we do it careful, we do it smart, and the second anything looks like it's going wrong, Asu pulls the cable, no arguments, no heroics. Understood. Understood, they said, nearly in unison, and Vess allowed herself. For just a moment, a flicker of pride in the strange, mismatched crew fate had assembled around her. Chorister, she called out, we're in, walk us through it. The integration took 6 hours, 6 hours of careful, methodical work that Vess would later describe. When she finally told this story to other captains over drinks in dockside bars, as the most terrifying kind of boring imaginable. Asu worked the physical connections with the precision of a surgeon, cross-checking every protocol against Chorister's guidance twice before committing. Imram monitored the linguistic coherence patterns on a jury-rigged display, watching for any sign that the integration was destabilizing the very structure it was meant to reinforce. Doro ran continuous diagnostics between the Wayfinder's deck and the station, his earlier nervousness transformed into a fierce, focused competence that made Vess quietly reconsider everything she'd assumed about the kid when she'd hired him 8 months ago. Vess herself did what captains did best in moments like this. She watched everyone else, ready to make the call nobody wanted her to make, and hoped she wouldn't have to. 3 hours in, it happened. The chamber's ambient lighting flickered, once, and Chorister's voice, when it spoke, carried a stutter that hadn't been there before, a half-second gap where a word should have been. Captain Karro, I am detecting an anomalous pressure spike along the seam boundary. This is not related to your integration efforts. Something on the other side has noticed the increased activity in the lock structure, and it is pressing closer than it has in. The voice cut off entirely for a full second, and every person in that chamber felt their heart stop with it. Then it resumed, quieter, more controlled, but unmistakably strained. Forgive me. I do not have accurate historical data for how close it has pressed before, because I have never allowed myself to record the worst incidents in detail. I found the practice too destabilizing. I am sorry. I need you to hurry. Asu, Vess said, sharp and steady. The voice she used when panic was a luxury nobody could afford. Status. 60% integration, Asu said, not looking up from his work, hands moving faster now but no less precise. I can push it, but if I rush the handshake protocols, we risk a cascade failure on both systems, not just ours. Do it anyway, Imras said, and everyone looked at her, surprised by the steel in her voice. The coherence patterns are degrading in real time, look. She turned her display so Vess could see it, a waveform that had been steady and rhythmic. An hour ago, now jagged, irregular, wrong in a way that made the listening skin along her jaw ripple violently. If Chorister's linguistic processing fails before we finish, the whole point of the integration collapses with it. We don't have the luxury of careful anymore. Asu's jaw tightened, but he nodded, and his hands moved faster. Chorister, Vess said, keeping her voice level with an effort that cost her more than she let show, talk to us. Keep talking. Full sentences, however hard it is. I need you steady. I will try, Chorister said, and Vess could hear, unmistakably now, the effort it was costing the machine to hold its own syntax together, the same way she'd once heard a wounded soldier fighting to keep his breathing even. I have held this seam for 187 years, Captain, and I confess I had begun to believe I understood the shape of my own limits. I did not expect to meet them today, in front of witnesses, after so long alone. There is a particular indignity to that, which I would find almost amusing under circumstances that were not actively threatening to unravel everything Dr. Wren and his crew died to protect. You're doing fine, Vess said. That was a joke, a whole, complete, grammatically correct joke. Keep doing that. I will endeavor to remain amusing under duress, Chorister said, and despite everything, despite the flickering lights and the jagged waveform and the low, wrong hum that had begun to vibrate through the deck plating beneath their feet, Doro let out a startled, half-hysterical laugh. 80%, Asu called out. 90, Imra, talk to me, is it holding? Imra's eyes were fixed on her display, her whole body tense with concentration. It's stabilizing, the pattern smoothing out. Chorister, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. I am reciting, Chorister said, and there was something almost embarrassed in its tone, poetry. Dr. Wren's favorite. I found that structured verse, rhythm, meter, rhyme, holds the coherence pattern more efficiently under stress than ordinary speech. I did not expect to need it again after so many years. I am glad I remembered how. 95%, Asu said. 98, 99. A pause that stretched agonizingly long. Then softer. We're integrated, full handshake complete. Chorister, you should be feeling the additional capacity now. The lights in the chamber steadied. The wrongness in the deck plating faded, not vanishing entirely but retreating, like a tide pulling back from a shore it had briefly claimed. And when Chorister spoke again, its voice was, for the first time since they'd boarded, completely, perfectly steady. I feel, it said, and then paused, genuinely, audibly moved in a way that made even Asu's stoic Terralin composure crack into something softer. I feel less alone. I did not know until this moment how much of the strain I have carried for 187 years was simply the weight of doing this by myself. Thank you, all of you. I do not have words sufficient to the size of this gratitude, which, given what I am, is perhaps the most honest compliment I can offer you. Vess let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for 6 hours straight, and around her, she watched her crew do the same. The particular collective exhale of people who had walked right up to the edge of disaster, and through skill and stubbornness and no small amount of luck, walked back from it together. Is it over? Doro asked, hopeful and exhausted in equal measure. The immediate crisis, yes, Chorister said. The underlying situation, no. What pressed against the seam today will press again, someday, perhaps not for years, perhaps not for decades, but the wound does not heal, and my duty here does not end. What has changed, thanks to you, is that I now have the capacity to hold that duty for a great deal longer than 6 to 11 years. I estimate, with your integration added to my architecture, a functional lifespan closer to 2 centuries before I would need assistance again. That is not nothing, Captain. That is a great deal of borrowed time for me, and for the 6 people still sleeping down the hall, who deserve to wake into a story that ends better than the one they fell asleep inside. Wake them, Vess said. Now, while we're still here, if your systems can spare it, I think it's time. There was a long pause, and Vess wondered if she'd overstepped, if that decision belonged to Chorister alone after 187 years of guardianship. But when the voice returned, it was quiet, almost reverent. I have wanted to do this for longer than you have been alive, Captain Karro. Longer than your species has likely existed in its current form. Yes, I believe it is time. Would you like to be there when they open their eyes? We wouldn't miss it, Vess said, and meant it with her whole chest. The waking took another hour, careful and gradual, 6 bodies browg. HT slowly back from a stillness so profound it barely qualified as sleep, warmed by degrees, monitored by systems that had been waiting 187 years for exactly this purpose. Vess and her crew stood back near the chamber's edge, giving the moment the space it deserved, and watched as, one by one, 6 pairs of eyes opened onto a future none of them could have imagined when they closed. Dr. Elias Wren's pod was the last to open, and when he sat up, frail and disoriented but unmistakably, gloriously alive, the first thing he did was look toward the nearest speaker grill, the way a man looks toward an old and trusted friend. Chorister, he rasped, voice cracked with disuse but steady in its intent. Talk to me, full sentence, prove it's really over. It is good to see you again, Dr. Wren, Chorister said, and Vess would swear for the rest of her life that she heard something like tears in a voice that had no throat to produce them. The seam holds, the station stands, and I have at long last some very extraordinary guests I would like you to meet. Wren turned slowly, taking in the 4 strangers standing at the edge of his chamber, an Ostren, a Terrelin, a Keth, and a woman whose skin shimmered faintly in the low light. None of them human, all of them here, all of them having chosen of their own free will to stay and fight for a promise made by people they'd never met, in a language that belonged to a species not their own. "Well," Wren said, and something that was almost a laugh cracked through the rasp of his voice, "I suppose we finally get to find out what happened to everyone back home." That answer, it turned out, would take much longer to find than any of them expected, and would carry its own share of grief and revelation. But that was a story for another day, another log entry, another chapter in the long, strange history of Meridian Anchor. For now, in that chamber, 6 people who had given up 2 centuries of their lives to hold a wound in reality closed learned that they had not held it alone after all, not truly, not really, because a machine built to guard a secret had, somewhere in 187 years of solitary vigilance, become something more than its programming ever intended. It had become a keeper of promises, a patient, careful voice in the dark. A friend, waiting faithfully for the day someone would finally answer its hail in return. Vess Karro stayed 3 more days at Meridian Anchor before her crew prepared to leave, helping the newly woken crew adjust to systems 2 centuries advanced beyond what they remembered, trading stories across a gap of time that felt, in that small archive room, less like an unbridgeable chasm and more like the space between 2 old friends catching up after a long absence. Wren, once his strength returned, spent hours with Imra poring over the linguistic patterns Chorister had refined across 2 centuries of solitary practice, the 2 of them speaking a shared language of syntax and structure that left the rest of the crew good-naturedly lost within minutes. On the morning they finally departed, Vess stood at the airlock with Chorister's presence humming quietly through the corridor speakers, and found, unexpectedly, that she didn't want to say goodbye. "You'll be all right," she said, not quite a question. "I will be considerably more than all right, Captain," Chorister said. "I have 6 old friends returned to me, a renewed capacity that should serve this station for 2 centuries more. And I hope, the promise of a new one, that you and your crew might visit again, someday, not as strangers hailing a ghost, but as the people who helped a very tired guardian remember what it felt like to be less alone." "We'll come back," Vess said. "That's not a courtesy, that's a promise, and where I'm from those matter." "Where I am from as well," Chorister said, "though I confess my origins are somewhat more complicated than most. Safe travels, Captain Karro. Tell the story when you get where you're going. Tell it honestly, grammar and all. I find after everything that I have grown rather fond of the idea that somewhere out among the stars, people might hear it and understand exactly why perfect grammar, spoken by an abandoned station at the edge of nowhere, was never really about grammar at all. It was about proving that someone was still there, still whole, still worth answering." The Wayfinder's debt pulled away from Meridian Anchor an hour later, and Vess watched through the viewport as the station shrank behind them, its long spokes catching the thin light of the dying star, the black hole beside it hanging silent and strange, and, for the first time in 200 years, a little less alone in the dark. Somewhere behind that hull, 6 people who had sacrificed the better part of their lives were finally, truly awake again, and a machine that had spent nearly 2 centuries speaking in perfect, careful, deliberate and tenses into an empty void had finally found someone worth speaking to. Vess thought about that all the way home, about the strange, quiet heroism of a voice that never stopped answering, year after year, hail after hail, long after anyone had any reason to expect a reply. She thought about how easy it would have been for Chorister to let its language slip, to let the careful grammar fray at the edges the way everything eventually frays when no one is watching and no one seems to be listening. It hadn't. It had held the line in the smallest, most human way imaginable, one correct sentence at a time, because somewhere in its architecture, built by people who believed language itself, could be an act of defiance against the dark. It had learned that speaking clearly, speaking truly, speaking with care, was its own kind of courage. She didn't know, as the stars stretched into the long silver blur of transit, whether the wound behind that black hole would ever fully heal, or whether some future crew, centuries from now, would find themselves standing where she had stood, listening to a voice they didn't expect, answering with a grammar too perfect to be an accident. But she knew this much, with the kind of certainty that settles into a person's bones and stays there. Somewhere out past the edge of charted space, a lonely station was still singing its careful, patient song into the dark, still keeping its promise, still waiting, hopeful now instead of merely dutiful, for the next voice brave enough to answer back. And if that voice ever came looking for her, she thought, for the record, for whoever might one day tell this story again, she would want them to know one thing above all else. It was worth it, every word of it worth it.